Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has provided a temporary halt to hostilities, but uncertainty looms over its stability and future developments. Though an agreement had been reached last month, tensions remain high as both sides navigate fragile negotiations and external pressures. With hostage exchanges, diplomatic interventions, and new geopolitical proposals shaping the discourse, critical questions arise about the sustainability of the truce and its broader implications. To discuss these pressing issues, we invite Paik Seung-hoon, a researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Welcome, Dr. Paik.
Nice to meeting you again.
And also joining us is Robert Lawrence, assistant professor at Dongduk Women's University. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Dr. Paik. On the 19th of last month, Israel and Hamas agreed to a phased ceasefire, halting fighting for 6 weeks. How has the situation been during the ceasefire, which is nearing a month now?
So the ceasefire has led to a significant reduction in large-scale military operations, bringing a much-needed respite to the regions. So both parties have engaged in exchange of hostage and prisoners as well. So on February 15th, 3 Israeli hostages were released in exchange for 369 Palestinian prisoners. And these exchanges are part of the initial phase of the ceasefire agreement, which is set to conclude in just over 2 weeks. There are tensions persist. I mean, just yesterday on February 16th, an Israeli airstrike resulted in the death of 3 Palestinian police officers in Gaza. And the Gaza Interior Ministry condemned this as a breach of the ceasefire, while the Israel military claimed that it targeted armed individuals approaching to their forces. And the humanitarian situation remains still dire. I mean, while aid deliveries have increased, challenges persist in rebuilding and infrastructures and providing essential services. So yes, the ceasefire has allowed for some relief, but situation on the ground is a bit delicate. So the implementation of upcoming phases of the agreement will be critical in determining whether a sustainable peace can be achieved or not.
Right, so the situation seems quite tense. What about Professor Lawrence? Last week, we're aware that Hamas announced the indefinite postponement of the 6th hostage release, pushing the agreement to a brink of collapse. But fortunately, they released the hostages as scheduled. Could you also tell us why this ceasefire is so unstable and vulnerable?
Right. So fortunately, Hamas did decide to release the 3 hostages on Saturday, but there's still a great deal of instability with the ceasefire. It has a lot of problems, and there are several variables that play into this. So first, Hamas is encountering diminishing returns on its hostages, and both sides know this. It has decreasing leverage as it releases more of them, especially the women. And it's likely worried about its ability to get Israel back to the negotiation table for the final 2 phases of the plan. Secondly, Hamas sent a high-level delegation to Tehran last weekend, leading a lot of Israelis to presume that Iran's still heavily involved in the decision-making process. Third, Donald Trump's Gaza plan created a lot of chaos, and it was obviously rejected by Hamas leadership, and there were hints that Hamas wanted more guarantees before moving forward. Fourth, several members of the Israeli government are pushing for a resumption of military engagement. Fifth, the duration of the deal works against the deal itself because people lose patience as problems arise during the lengthy process. And then lastly, for weeks now, both Hamas and Israel have been alleging noncompliance, to the ceasefire itself. So, when you combine all of these factors, you have a high level of fairly justified distrust coming from both sides.
Right, so the core issue is that they don't really trust each other perfectly.
That's right.
To push through with the ceasefire. But regarding the latest delay of the hostage release, President Trump from the U.S. has warned that if Hamas does not release the hostages, hell will break out. What did he mean by this, Dr. Paik? And do you think this warning actually influenced Hamas's change in stance?
Yes, I mean, the President Trump's statement was a clear ultimatum to Hamas, I mean, demanding the immediate release of all hostage in Gaza. So it was a direct message to them, making it clear that U.S. and its allies would not tolerate any delay in the release of hostage. So by saying hell will open, President Trump was not only referring to the possibility of intensified military action, which includes strikes on Hamas leadership targets, but increased economic sanction or diplomatic measures against Hamas and its affiliates. So this was intended to exert maximum pressure on the Hamas to expedite the hostages' release. Indeed, the warning contributed to the shift in Hamas' approach. So Hamas initially attempted to stall the deal, but soon after Trump's warning, they had no choice but to resume the hostage release. Hamas was left in no maneuvering room. I mean, their back was, and is still against the wall. So there's no other option that they could, use. And they knew that any delay would result in direct consequences. So the speed with which they reversed their position after the warning of Trump is a clear indicator that they understood Hamas had no alternatives but to follow through with the hostage release. So it did work.
Right. So it seems that America's influence is very big in this point. But although the ceasefire didn't collapse at this time, the likelihood of continued conflict seems high. Given that Professor Lawrence has mentioned there's high distrust between the two sides. The first phase agreement will expire by the 1st of next month, and the negotiations for the second phase are needed to reach, in order to come up with an agreement. But Professor Lawrence, how do you foresee this developing, the second negotiations?
Mm-hmm. Well, the ceasefire itself is designed to be a long, drawn-out process, which also makes it vulnerable. There are 3 stages, and each are supposed to be 42 days. So new hurdles that kind of inevitably arise over the course of this time, they tend to accentuate the fragility of the agreement itself. According to the agreement, negotiations for the second phase were scheduled to begin 16 days after the agreement went into effect on January 19th. So negotiations are already about 2 weeks past due. As part of phase 2, negotiations, this vaguely worded concept of sustainable calm has led a lot of people to believe that a permanent peace deal will need to be negotiated in this phase. However, Netanyahu's government has a coalition that has a razor-thin majority in the Knesset right now. So if he were to give in too much and upset the far-right parties of his coalition, the government could collapse, which would be terrible for him because he'd have to answer for some legal issues and for security failures in the lead up to October 7th. So there's some real domestic constraints that might prevent the second phase from moving forward. Additionally, there are members in the U.S. And Israeli governments who are continuing to insist that Hamas cannot be left to rule Gaza after the conflict. So Hamas probably doubts the sincerity of the negotiations to implement phase 2. However, the Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, just yesterday said that the talks on phase 2 will continue this week at a location to be determined. He said that he's been in touch with the Qatari Prime Minister, Israeli Prime Minister, and Egypt's Director of Intelligence, and that he planned on continuing talks this week to get to the end of phase 2 successfully. In fact, President Trump, he has diplomats and special envoys working in multiple regional countries to prevent any breakdowns of ceasefires that would undermine his regional ambitions. So, there's a lot of mixed signaling going on, and it'll certainly be a challenging road ahead.
Right, but we will be able to see the second negotiations in the coming days, right?
Hopefully.
Mm-hmm. But on the 16th, U.S. Secretary of State Rubio, who visited Israel, once again expressed full support for Israel, saying Hamas must be eradicated. Professor Paik, what kind of impact could such a statement have on the ceasefire, given that the second phase negotiations are just in the corner?
So, we only have 2 more weeks to go to close down the first agreement of the first phase. So the transition to the next phase to the ceasefire agreement depends on the several key conditions that both Israel and Hamas must fulfill. So first and foremost, it is the release of Israel hostage and Palestinian prisoners. So under the agreement, Hamas is expected to release 33 Israel hostage, prioritizing children, women, elderly, and female soldiers. In exchange, Israel must continue releasing Palestinian prisoners with a total of up to 1,904 detainees. It is essential as the ceasefire hinges on both sides upholding their commitment to these exchanges. Second is sustainable calm of the region and military withdrawal. So both parties are required to establish and maintain a sustainable calm. Israel is expected to withdraw its military forces from Gaza Strip, facilitating a peace environment conducive to further negotiation. However, this also depends on Hamas maintaining order and not engaging in any further provocation. Third is a humanitarian aid assess. Humanitarian relief is also a key element here. So the agreement stipulates that Israel must allow approximately 600 aid trucks to enter Gaza daily. These trucks carry essential supplies, including food, medical equipment, and reconstruction materials. Given the severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the smooth delivery of aid will be a major test of the ceasefire success. Any obstructions or delay in humanitarian assistance could derail negotiation for the next phase. And the last but not the least is ceasefire adherence of both parties. Israel and Hamas must strictly adhere to the terms of ceasefire, refraining from any action that could be perceived as a violation, and to build mutual trust, as Professor Lawrence said. There hasn't been trust built between the two parties. So in order to build mutual trust and ensure the agreement's progression, they need to adhere with the ceasefire conditions. But it remains uncertain because while both sides have an incentives to extend the ceasefire, for Hamas, they need this to secure further prisoner release and for Israel to retrieve more hostages. But the risk of renewed conflict remain high because, like what we have said, what we have discussed, I mean, there are like mistrust between these two parties.
Right, so it seems like there's a lot of points that the two sides need to, check into to make sure they will be able to trust each other. But what about the remarks of Rubio? Do you think it would have a big impact as well?
No, I think it's just kind of like building up the leverage. I mean, like before getting into second phase, they want to have more higher ground. They want to push Hamas and say, oh, we are this like stubborn. So you should come up with, more compliant manner rather than, try to make a deal out of it. So for the time being, we have to just watch and see how this Rubio comment will gonna play out in the second phase negotiation process.
Right. So amid this, President Trump has proposed relocating Palestinian residents to neighboring countries and occupying the Gaza Strip to develop it into a coastal resort city. And this plan has caused a stir worldwide. What is President Trump's intention behind such a plan, Professor Lawrence?
Right. This plan has not won him any popularity contest in global politics. It's been widely rejected, of course, in the region, and naturally it was rejected by Hamas as well, with the exception of Israel in the region. President Trump is a difficult man to predict, and that isn't by mistake. But I believe it's highly unlikely that you're going to see a U.S. takeover of the Gaza Strip. Firstly, he's pretty averse to sending U.S. troops into conflict since he came on the political scene a decade ago. Even though he mentioned that no troops would be necessary, it's kind of tough to imagine how it would work without any. Secondly, his administration and himself, they've been intentionally unclear when explaining exactly what this takeover would entail when reporters ask for clarifications. And this has kind of created more questions than answers. And while this inconsistency or unpredictability is very frustrating for a lot of people, I think this is a negotiating tactic. Okay. In this case, he's trying to compel other regional actors to take a bigger role in solving the problem. Regional states who seek stability know that any action like a U.S. takeover of the Gaza Strip would yield further instability in the region, right? So I don't think he has any genuine desire to take over the Gaza Strip. Rather, I think he intends to make unrealistic demands to mobilize Arab states in the region. It's just kind of another example of his transactional approach to international politics. This angers a lot of regional and international partners. But actually, I think he probably has high hopes for the Egyptian plan and what happens in the Arab summit in Saudi Arabia that the leaders of UAE, Qatar, Egypt, and Jordan will be attending later this week, and the Arab summit in Cairo next week. Of course, there's no guarantee that this is going to yield the desired results. This transactional approach may actually push some of these allies away from the U.S. in the long run. So it's kind of a high risk, high reward approach.
Right. So Jordan and Egypt, which have been mentioned as potential countries for the relocation of Palestinian residents, are protesting. Like we've mentioned, many countries are against it. But in response, President Trump has pressured them by saying that the U.S. could cut off aid to these countries if they used to take in the refugees. Dr. Beck, we saw you nodding as Professor Lawrence has been speaking about that, saying that it was a strategy by President Trump. What about your idea? What do you agree with him, and how feasible do you think this idea is?
So the feasibility of President Trump's plan faces significant challenges, like Professor Rollins have mentioned. So both Jordan and Egypt have firmly rejected the idea of resettling Palestinians, refugees from Gaza. And King Abdullah of Jordan, during a recent meeting at the White House, emphasized his country's refusal to support the relocation plan, citing the concerns over national interest and regional stability. Similarly, Egypt leadership has expressed strong opposition, warning that such a move could violate international law and destabilize the region. So the threat to withhold U.S. aid adds pressure, but also risks straining the diplomatic relation and could lead to a broader geopolitical repercussions. So given the unified stance of this nation and complexities involved, the implementation of President Trump's Gaza occupation plan appears highly impractical at this time. But, never say never. And we are all aware of the logic of money talks. So we should wait. We have to wait and see how the situation will progress and what are the incentives and inducement that Trump could provide to participating the country. But if it's not that tempting or attractive, it is very highly unlikely that the state like Jordan and Egypt will gonna comply with the Trump's plan or Trump's administration demands.
Mm-hmm. Now, also touching back upon the situation in Israel and Hamas, Professor Lawrence, how do you think Trump's latest announcement on Gaza will actually impact the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement and also the broader Middle Eastern situation?
Well, in the short term, I think it'll get a lot of headlines and attention. Hamas will, of course, reject any plan that involves forcing Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, and it'll suspect any Arab proposal that they fear involves them being forced from power. So in the short term, they may get a rally around the flag effect. In the long term, I think it could go several directions. Arab states could call his bluff. I think that's probably unlikely because we already know that there are several proposals underway as we speak. Now, the Arab proposal could be something that the Israelis won't accept, and then it returns to kind of a temporary stalemate and probably return to combat. Or more optimistically, it will encourage regional actors, more specifically Arab states, to get involved in the process and come up with a long-term solution as to who can govern the Gaza Strip. And then that could be negotiated with Israel. This Arab proposal, in theory, could actually replace the ceasefire agreement and have a little bit more longevity. Any deal like this would probably involve Gulf funding, and those Gulf states would want guarantees that they aren't wasting their money only for the cycle of violence to repeat itself. And any Arab plan, I think, is probably going to include some sort of plan for a Palestinian state, or else they could face, potential domestic backlash for it. So there may be several difficulties with any Arab proposal too. First, will it be something, that Israel can accept? Secondly, actually implementing the deal is much easier said than done. Third, how will Iran and their axis of resistance react to it? Because they have a say too, whether people like it or not. And then fourth, will President Trump be able to expand this idea into a more comprehensive security framework for the region itself?
Right. So with the ceasefire agreement still in a very delicate state, negotiations for next phase horizon, we'll have to keep close tabs on how regional players will continue to engage. But we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Lawrence and Dr. Beck. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.